The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was fitting, because Evelyn Bell had always believed that Tuesdays were the cruelest days of the week, ordinary enough to disappoint, and slow enough to let the disappointment linger. She had read it 3 times over before setting it down on the kitchen table of her aunt's cramped boarding house in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 1882. The letter was from a man named Thomas Conroy of Larkspur Creek, Texas, and he had described himself as a cattle rancher of 34 years, God-fearing, hardworking, and in possession of 200 acres of decent land with a house that had a proper roof and a well that had never run dry. He had found her name through a marriage broker named Mrs. Harriet Poole, who ran a small advertisement in the back pages of a ladies' periodical. He wrote with the careful grammar of a man who had not written many letters in his life, and there was something in the earnestness of it, the slight smudging where he had corrected a word, the careful looping of his signature, that made Evelyn feel as though the letter had been written by someone who truly meant it. She was 24 years old, and she had been working in her aunt's boarding house since she was 17, mending linen and scrubbing floors, and listening to other people's lives play out through thin walls. She had no particular hatred for the life she lived, but she had a deep and quiet hunger for something more, for open land, for purpose, for a home that truly belonged to her. She wrote back to Thomas Conroy within the week, and the letters that followed were brief but steady, practical and honest. He told her about the cattle. She told him about the winters in Ohio. He told her that the closest church was in the town of Millhaven, 12 miles east. She told him she attended Sunday services whenever her aunt's knee allowed them to walk together. They were not love letters, but they were sincere ones, and by August she had agreed to come. The train journey from Cincinnati to Texas took 3 days and covered distances that Evelyn had only ever imagined from maps. She watched the landscape flatten out through the window, watched the green hills of Ohio give way to the great rolling prairies of the South, and felt something loosen inside her chest, as though the bigness of the land was making room for something to breathe. She carried a single trunk and a carpet bag, a Bible her mother had left her, and a small tin brooch shaped like a sparrow that she had owned since she was a girl. She arrived at the station in Millhaven on a bright September morning with dust already threading through the air and the smell of horses and dry earth cutting clean through the heat. She had expected Thomas Conroy to be waiting on the platform. She had pictured him from his description, tall, she assumed, with a rancher's steady hands and a plain but decent face. Instead, there was a man leaning against the post at the end of the platform who was clearly not waiting for a train to arrive. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something careful and something troubled. He was perhaps 28 or 29. Lean in the way that hard outdoor work made a man lean, with dark hair pushed back beneath a worn hat and eyes the color of creek water in late summer. He wore a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and had the look of someone who had not slept well in several nights. When Evelyn stepped off the platform with her trunk and carpet bag, he pushed himself upright and came toward her, and she could see immediately that something was wrong. "Miss Bell," he said, and his voice was low and even as though he was working to keep it that way. "Miss Evelyn Bell." "Yes," she said, "I am, and you are not Thomas Conroy." He took his hat off with one hand and held it against his chest. "No, ma'am, my name is Homer Conroy. Thomas was my brother." She noticed the past tense immediately. It was a small word, only 2 letters, but it landed with the weight of something much larger. "Was," she repeated quietly. Homer looked at her steadily. He was clearly a man who did not flinch from difficult things even when they cost him. "Thomas died 6 days ago. A fever took him fast. I wrote to Mrs. Poole as soon as I could, but I wasn't certain the word would reach you before you boarded the train. I'm sorry, Miss Bell. I am deeply sorry that you've come all this way." Evelyn stood very still. The platform was nearly empty, and the sun was already warm on her shoulders, and somewhere down the street, a horse was moving along the hard dirt road with a sound like slow, patient drumbeats. She did not cry. She was not sure what she felt exactly. It was not grief, not truly, because she had never met Thomas Conroy. It was something more like the particular sorrow of a door closing, of a future you had only just begun to imagine becoming, quite suddenly, impossible. "I see," she said. "You'll want to take the next train back," Homer said. "I can help you with your trunk. The eastbound doesn't come through until Thursday, but the hotel on Main Street is decent, and I'll cover whatever the cost is." She looked at him for a moment. He was clearly a man in his own kind of grief, standing on a train platform in the September heat trying to do the right thing by a woman he didn't know, while his brother was barely cold in the ground. She could see the rawness of it in the set of his jaw, in the way he kept his eyes level even though the effort of it was visible. "Where is he buried?" she asked. Homer blinked. "On the ranch. There's a small cemetery there. My father's there too, and our mother." "I would like to see it," she said. "If that is not too much to ask." He studied her face for a moment as though trying to understand what kind of woman she was. Then he nodded once and picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing, and led her to a wagon waiting at the edge of the station road. The drive out to the Conroy Ranch took nearly 2 hours, most of it across open land that was so wide and so quietly beautiful that Evelyn found it difficult to hold onto the sorrow that had been building in her chest since the platform. The grass was tall and autumn gold, bending in a warm breeze, and the sky above it was so vast and blue it seemed almost theatrical, as though someone had stretched a painted canvas over the whole world. She watched it all from the wagon bench while Homer drove in silence, and eventually she said, "He told me about the well." Homer glanced at her. "I beg your pardon. In his letters. Thomas told me about the well. He said it had never run dry, not even in the worst summers." Homer was quiet for a moment. "That's true. My father dug it deep. Thomas was proud of it." "He seemed proud of many things," Evelyn said, and there was nothing accusatory in her voice, only observation. "The land. The cattle. The house with the proper roof." Homer almost smiled at that, though it didn't quite make it all the way. He worked hard for all of it, harder than most people knew. The ranch came into view around a bend in the track, a solid, wide-set house with a porch that ran the full length of the front, and behind it a barn of weathered red timber, and beyond that the land rolling out toward a low line of cottonwood trees along a creek. It was, Evelyn thought, exactly as she had imagined it from the letters, and the recognition of it moved through her strangely, like meeting someone's family after the person themselves is already gone. Homer helped her down from the wagon without ceremony but with a careful steadiness, and then led her around the side of the house to where a small fenced square of ground held 3 wooden crosses. Thomas's was the newest, the earth still dark and unsettled in front of it. Someone had placed a spray of dried wildflowers against it. Evelyn stood at the fence for a long moment. She held her carpetbag in both hands and looked at the cross and thought about a man she had never met but had, in some quiet way, been prepared to build a life with. She said a prayer under her breath, the kind that was more honest feeling than formal words, and then she turned back to Homer. "He honored you in his letters," she said. "He mentioned you twice. He said his brother Homer was the better hand with horses." Something shifted in Homer's face at that, a brief, unguarded flash of grief that he brought back under control quickly. "He was kind to say so." "Was it true?" "I don't know. We were different with them. He had patience. I have speed. Both have their uses." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had driven 2 hours to meet a woman his dead brother had planned to marry, and who had offered to pay for her hotel and her train home without being asked, and who stood now with his hat in his hands by his brother's grave trying to hold himself together with the quiet dignity of a man who had been raised to believe that grief was a private matter. "Mr. Conroy," she said, "would it be terribly improper if I asked to see the inside of the house?" He hesitated. "Miss Bell, I don't want you to feel any obligation to—" "I don't feel obligated," she said honestly. "I feel curious. I've been on a train for 3 days imagining this place, and I am not quite ready to stop imagining it." He looked at her for one more long moment, and then he said, "All right," and led her to the front porch. The house was clean and plainly furnished in the way that a bachelor's house is clean, orderly, but without warmth. Things in their places without any of the small decorative choices that indicate a woman's hand. There was a stone fireplace in the main room, a good solid table of dark wood, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that had been recently blacked. The floors were wide plank pine, and the windows were large enough to let in the afternoon light in long golden rectangles that fell across the floor like welcome rugs. Evelyn walked through the room slowly, touching nothing, just looking. Homer stood in the doorway of each room as she entered it, watching her with that same careful expression he'd had on the platform, as though he was uncertain of the right distance to keep. When she came back to the main room, she set her carpetbag down on the table and said, "He promised me a home. He promised me purpose. He promised me that I would not regret coming west." Homer said nothing, but she could see him listening with his whole body, the way people listen when they know something important is being said. "I know that you are the one standing in front of me and not him," she continued. "And I know that makes everything different. But I want you to understand, Mr. Conroy, that I did not come all this way simply to marry a man I'd never met. I came because I believed in what was being offered. The land, the work, the possibility of a real life." She paused. "I am not asking you for anything. I want to make that clear. But I would like to know whether there is any decent work to be had in Millhaven or nearby, because I cannot afford a train back to Cincinnati and I will not ask you to pay for it." Homer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thomas made you promises in those letters." "He did. He was my brother, and whatever he promised, he meant it. That is who Thomas was." He turned his hat in his hand, studying the brim. "I don't know exactly what the right thing is here, Miss Bell. I'll be honest with you. But I know that putting you on a train back to Ohio without anything settled feels wrong." So, he met her eyes. "Stay, for now. There's a room at the end of the hall that was meant for you. You can stay there while we figure out what is right. I'm not asking anything of you, but Thomas would have wanted you to at least have a fair chance." It was perhaps the most words he had strung together since the platform, and they were plainly meant. Evelyn looked at him and thought that whatever else Homer Conroy was, he was a man of genuine character, and that was not a small thing. "Thank you," she said. "I will not take advantage of your kindness." "I know you won't," he said, simply and without flattery, as though it were an observation and not a compliment. And so she stayed. The first weeks were careful and quiet, two strangers in a house built for different people, learning the rhythms of shared space with the diligence of people who did not want to make mistakes. Homer rose before dawn and was already out with the cattle by the time Evelyn came to the kitchen to start the stove. She cooked breakfast and left a plate warming for him, which he came in to eat at 7 with his hat hung by the door and his sleeves rolled down against the morning cool. They spoke over meals about practical things, the state of the well, the need to patch a section of fence along the south pasture, whether the creek would flood if the autumn rains came heavy. It was not exciting conversation, but it was honest conversation, and Evelyn found that she preferred it to the pretty, hollow talk she had grown up hearing in her aunt's boarding house. She learned the ranch quickly. There was a kitchen garden that had been neglected since Thomas fell ill, and she set about restoring it with the focused energy of someone who needed her hands to be busy. She replanted the late-season crops: turnips, winter squash, dried beans, and put up preserves from the last of the summer's wild plums that she found growing along the creek. She mended the curtains in the front room and patched the gap in the parlor floor where the boards had warped. She was not doing it to make herself useful, or not only for that reason. She was doing it because the work felt good, felt like the beginning of something, and she was not ready to let go of that feeling. Homer watched all of this without comment, but she could tell that he noticed it. He was a man who paid attention to everything, quietly and without announcement, in the way that people who have spent long years outdoors learn to notice small changes in the world around them. The hands who worked the ranch were 3 in number. A wiry older man named Dolph, who had worked for the Conroys since before Homer and Thomas were born, and 2 younger men named Pete and Cal, who had come from a ranch further west that had gone under during a dry spell the previous year. They were all respectful to Evelyn in the manner of men who have been raised to treat women politely, but who are slightly uncertain of how to behave toward a woman in an unusual situation. Dolph, who was the oldest and had the most authority after Homer, was the most at ease with her, and she liked him immediately. He had a broad, seamed face and a slow, wry humor, and he drank his coffee black as creek mud and always thanked her for it as though it were a gift. One afternoon in the second week, Evelyn was in the kitchen garden pulling the last of the summer weeds when she heard the sound of hoofbeats coming fast up the ranch road. She straightened up and shaded her eyes and saw a rider coming at full gallop, a young man she didn't recognize, barely older than 18, on a horse that was breathing hard. He went straight to the barn, and she heard him calling for Homer, and then Homer's voice answering, and then a long, quiet interval before Homer came out into the yard with his hat pulled low and something changed about the set of his shoulders. She waited until the rider had gone before she went to him. "What is it?" He looked at her as though deciding something. Then he said, "There's trouble down in Millhaven. You know the saloon keeper named Prout?" "I don't. I've barely been to town." "He's been buying up land along the creek valley, some of it legally, some of it by finding excuses to call in small debts that ranchers can't cover. He's got his eye on several properties, and I've heard a rumor that he's been talking to men about whether the Conroy Ranch might be vulnerable now that Thomas is gone." He paused. "Thomas carried the deed. I've been looking for it." "Where would it be?" "He kept his papers in a lockbox in the bedroom. I have the key, but I've been putting off going through it." He said this without self-pity but with a visible effort, and she understood. Going through a dead man's things was its own kind of grief. "I'll help you," she said. "If you want me to." He looked at her for a moment, and she thought she saw something shift in his eyes, a slight easing of the tightness around them. "All right," he said. They went through Thomas's lockbox together that evening after supper, sitting at the wide table with a lamp between them and the September night pressing in warm and thick against the windows. The box contained the ranch deed, a small amount of cash, a handful of receipts, 2 letters from Homer that Thomas had kept which Homer set aside without reading, and a folded page that turned out to be Thomas's own letter to Mrs. Poole's agency, the original inquiry that had led eventually to Evelyn's arrival. Homer held that one for a moment, reading it, and then set it down with great care. The deed was clear and in Thomas's name, with a line indicating that in the event of his death the property passed to his next of kin, which was Homer. Homer let out a slow breath when he confirmed this and said, "All right, that's what I needed to know. So Prout has no claim. Not a legal one, but that doesn't always matter to men like him." He looked up from the papers. "I'll ride into Millhaven tomorrow and make sure the county recorder has the death registered and the deed transferred. Once that's done, it becomes harder for him to maneuver." "What can I do?" He shook his head slightly, not dismissively but thoughtfully. "Nothing right now. I just want to make sure everything is in order." She nodded, but she was thinking about what he had said, that it doesn't always matter to men like him. She understood enough about the world to know that legal protections were only as strong as the people willing to enforce them, and that out here in the wide country between law and consequence, there was often a great deal of room for bad men to operate. Homer rode to Millhaven the next morning and came back in the late afternoon with the deed properly transferred, and a look on his face that said the business had gone straightforwardly, but not without friction. He told Evelyn over supper that Prout had been at the county office when he arrived, which was probably not a coincidence, and that Prout had made a remark about the strangeness of a woman living on a ranch with a man she was not married to. Evelyn set down her fork. "What did you say to that?" Homer looked at her across the table. "I said it was none of his business." "Good." He also implied that the arrangement was proof that the ranch was being poorly managed, and that the county might have reason to appoint an overseer. He said this matter-of-factly, but she could hear the edge under it. "It's not a legal argument that has any merit, but it's the kind of thing that gets talked about in saloons and becomes a rumor that takes on a life of its own." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "People in town must be talking about me." He met her eyes. "Probably. I'm sorry for that. It's not," he stopped. "It's not fair." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She thought of the injustice of it plainly. A woman with nowhere to go, trying to make something honest out of an impossible situation, and the first thing people thought of was impropriety. "But I have lived through unfair things before." "I know you have," he said, and then seemed surprised that he had said it as though he'd meant it only as a thought. She looked at him. "How would you know that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because people don't come west as mail-order brides if they have a great deal of good options," he said. "I don't mean that unkindly." "I know you don't," she said. "And you're right. I came because Ohio had nothing left in it for me. I had no family worth speaking of, no money, no prospects." Thomas's letters seemed like the most honest offer I'd ever received from anyone. She paused. "I still believe they were." Something moved across Homer's face at that. Something warm and complicated. And he turned his attention back to his plate in the way that men do when they are feeling something they are not ready to name. October came in with a sharpness in the air that Evelyn found bracing and beautiful. The light changed, going lower and more golden across the prairie, and the mornings had a bite to them that made the coffee feel necessary in a way it hadn't during the warm September weeks. The cattle had to be moved to the lower pastures, and Homer and the hands were out from first light, and Evelyn found herself with more hours of solitude in the house than she had expected. She was not a person who minded solitude. She had grown up in a boarding house full of strangers and had learned early to find her own company sufficient. But this solitude was different. It was the solitude of a house that had once been a family's home and now held the particular silence of grief, and she felt it sometimes like a presence in the room, not frightening but serious. She began to cook seriously, not just for sustenance but for the pleasure of it, the way that cooking in a proper kitchen with enough space and good ingredients could become a kind of art. She made cornbread and dried bean soup, and roasted cuts of beef seasoned with dried herbs she found growing wild along the south fence line. She made apple butter from a basket of late-season apples that Dolph brought from somewhere without explanation, setting the jars up in the larder with a satisfaction she recognized as the pleasure of providing. Homer noticed. He always noticed in his quiet way. One evening after supper he said, "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My aunt's boarding house," she said. "When you are feeding 12 different people 3 times a day, you learn quickly what works and what doesn't. You were there a long time. 7 years, since I was 17. He considered this. "What happened when you were 17? She was quiet for a moment. "My mother died. My father had been gone since I was 10. He just went one day and didn't come back. When my mother died, my aunt took me in because there was no one else. She was a decent woman, my aunt. She didn't make me feel unwelcome, but it was never truly home." Homer was watching her with the quiet, full attention that was particular to him. "I know what that's like," he said. "Being in a place that is not quite home. You grew up here." "I did. But after my mother died, when Thomas and I were teenagers, there was a period of a few years where the ranch was struggling and Thomas and I were not getting along particularly well. And it felt like the place I belonged had become somewhere foreign." He paused. "We worked through it, Thomas and I, later." "How old were you when your mother died?" 15. Thomas was 19. She nodded. There was a quietness between them that was not uncomfortable, the kind of quietness that falls between people who are discovering that they have spoken the same language of loss without knowing it. "I'm glad you worked through it," she said. "With Thomas." "So am I." His voice was careful on that. "I'm glad I have that to hold on to." She looked at him across the table, this man who was learning to sit with his grief the way you learn to sit with a sore tooth, working around it, adapting, and felt something in her own chest respond with a warmth that surprised her. She turned her attention back to her coffee. In the middle of October, Prout made his move. It was not dramatic, as moves made by men like Prout rarely were. He sent a man, a heavy-set fellow named Garris with a badge pinned to his shirt that Evelyn suspected was not entirely legitimate. To the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, while Homer was out on the South Range. Garris arrived at the front door and Evelyn answered it, and he told her with elaborate politeness that he was there to discuss a matter of debt that had come to Mr. Pruitt's attention. Apparently, Thomas Conroy had, according to Garris, borrowed $40 from Pruitt on a handshake agreement the previous winter, and the debt was now due and had transferred to the estate. Evelyn looked at the man steadily. She had grown up watching her aunt run a boarding house and manage men who thought they could take advantage of a woman on her own, and she recognized the shape of this game immediately. "I am not the estate's representative," she said calmly. "You will need to speak with Mr. Homer Conroy. And when might that be? You're welcome to wait on the porch. He'll be back by evening." She did not invite Garris inside, and she did not offer him coffee, and she stood in the doorway until he had retreated to the yard before she went back into the house. She found Dolph in the barn and told him what had happened, and Dolph rode out to find Homer immediately. Homer was back within the hour, and his conversation with Garris was short, and Evelyn gathered from the tone of it through the window, not particularly friendly. When Garris had gone, Homer came inside with a look that was controlled but had something sharp underneath it. "There is no debt," he said. "I went through every paper in Thomas's lockbox. There is no record of any loan from Pruitt, and Pruitt is the kind of man who would have demanded a written record if there had been one." "I know," Evelyn said. "I didn't let him in." Homer looked at her. "I heard, Dolph told me." He paused. "That was well done." "I have dealt with men who believe women are easily managed," she said. "It is a great advantage to know when that is happening." Homer almost laughed at that, not quite, but close. The corners of his mouth moved in a way that transformed his face briefly and made him look younger, less burdened. She found herself wanting to see it again, that almost laugh. "I'm going to ride into Millhaven tomorrow and speak to the sheriff," he said. "We have a real one, whatever Pruitt might think. Sheriff Aldred has been here 20 years and he does not favor men like Pruitt." "Good," she said. "I will come with you." He blinked. "You don't need to, I want to," she said firmly. "I am not going to sit here and let this ranch be threatened by a saloon keeper while I peel potatoes. Besides," she added more lightly, "I need to buy thread. I've been mending with the same spool since September." He looked at her for a long moment, and there it was again, that almost smile, and something warmer beneath it that he turned away from before she could examine it too closely. They rode into Millhaven together the next morning, Evelyn on a brown mare named Rosie that was Homer's most even-tempered horse, and Homer on a gray gelding named Slate that moved with the kind of authority that reflected its rider. The town of Millhaven was a proper frontier town, a main street of 3 blocks with a general store, a land office, a church, a saloon, a hotel, a livery, and the sheriff's office, all set along a wide dirt road that would become a river of mud in serious rain and a cloud of dust in serious heat. There were perhaps 300 people in and around it, the population swelling on Saturdays when the ranching families came in for supplies and company. People watched them ride down the main street, and Evelyn felt the watching as a physical thing, like a hand on her shoulder. She kept her chin up and her eyes forward, and did not let herself care about it, or at least she performed not caring about it with sufficient conviction that it became nearly the same thing. Sheriff Aldred was a compact man of perhaps 55 with a gray mustache, and the manner of someone who had seen enough of human nature to be unimpressed by any particular example of it. He listened to Homer's account of Garris's visit with his hands folded on his desk and his eyes steady, and when Homer was done he said, "I know Pruitt. I know Garris. The badge Garris was wearing is from a county 200 miles west that stopped existing as a legal jurisdiction 3 years ago. He has no authority here." "I suspected as much," Homer said. "I'll pay Pruitt a visit," Aldred said. "Make it clear that any further attempts to represent false debts against the Conroy estate will result in charges being brought." He looked at Evelyn. "And you are Miss Bell?" "I am." "You're living at the ranch?" "I am," she said again, meeting his gaze without flinching. Aldred studied her for a moment. He was not an unkind man, she could tell, but he was a man who dealt in reality. And reality in 1882 in a small Texas town was that a single woman living alone with a single man was a complicated business socially, whatever it was legally. "I ask because it may be relevant," he said. "Prout will use any angle he can. That angle will be less useful to him if he paused. If things are more clear," Homer said. "I understand your meaning, Sheriff." Evelyn looked at Homer. He was looking at Aldred, but she could see something working through his expression that was complex and private. Then he looked at her, and she saw the question in his eyes before he said any words. She said, very quietly, "I would not be opposed to a conversation about it." Homer held her gaze for one moment that felt considerably longer than it was, and then he said to Aldred, "We'll work it out. Thank you, Sheriff." They left the sheriff's office and stood on the boardwalk in the October sun, and Homer said, "I didn't mean to put you in a position." "You didn't," she said. "I mean it's not I would never want you to feel that you had to, Homer." She used his name for perhaps the first time without thinking about it, and the ease of it surprised her slightly. "I know what you would and would not want. I have been watching you for 5 weeks. I am not a woman who makes decisions because she feels she has no choice. I have made enough of those in my life." He looked at her. The street was moving around them, a wagon going by, a woman and child coming out of the general store, the distant sound of the livery, and they were standing very still in the middle of it. "What are you saying exactly?" he asked. "I am saying that if you ask me a question," she said carefully, "it might get an honest answer." There was a long pause. She could see him working through it, this man who was careful with everything, who measured twice before he acted, who had spent 5 weeks trying to do the right thing by a woman he hadn't expected and a brother he was still mourning. "Miss Bell," he said finally, "I think a great deal of you. More perhaps than I have any right to, given the circumstances." "The circumstances are unusual," she agreed, "but that does not mean the thinking is wrong." "No," he said, "it doesn't." Another pause. "Would you walk with me, down to the end of the street and back? I think better when I'm moving." She would. They walked the length of Millhaven's main street in the morning light, not touching, speaking occasionally and quietly. And by the time they reached the livery and turned back toward the general store, Homer had asked her something and she had answered it, and the shape of their future had changed quite completely from what either of them had planned at the beginning of that year. They were married in the Millhaven church on the second Saturday of November, 1882, by a Reverend Good who had the good grace not to make the situation feel strange. It was a small ceremony. Dolph was there, and Pete and Cal, and a handful of townspeople, including a woman named Martha Blaine who ran the millinery shop and had taken a liking to Evelyn over several autumn visits for thread and buttons. Sheriff Aldred came as well, which might have felt like a practical measure, but was performed with genuine warmth. Evelyn wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had let out at the waist and retrimmed at the collar, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had gathered herself from the ranch property. Homer wore his only suit, which fit him well enough and made him look slightly different from the daily version of himself, more formal, more aware of being seen, and he stood at the altar with the same careful steadiness with which he did everything. And when he said the words, he said them looking directly at her with an honesty that made the whole ceremony feel very real. Afterward, at the small gathering that Martha Blaine organized at the hotel's dining room, Dolph toasted them with genuine affection, and Pete cried briefly before insisting that something was in his eye, and Cal ate a great deal of cake without comment, which was his way of celebrating. Evelyn stood beside Homer and felt the warmth of people around her who wished them well, and felt the strangeness of the day sitting alongside the rightness of it. On the way home in the wagon, as the late afternoon turned the prairie gold and amber, Homer said, "Are you all right?" She considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am. It's a strange situation. I want you to know I understand that." "It is strange," she agreed, "but it is also the most I have ever felt like myself standing somewhere." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said, "it does." They drove the rest of the way in companionable silence, and when they arrived at the ranch and Homer helped her down from the wagon, he held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, and she did not withdraw it, and that was enough for now. The winter of 1882 came in slowly and then all at once, the way winters do in that part of Texas, weeks of warm, clear days, and then a change in the wind, and the temperature dropping 20 degrees overnight, and the whole world going hard and quiet. The cattle were brought in close, and the hands worked long hours, and the house was warm from the stove in the kitchen and the fireplace in the main room, and Evelyn found herself deeply and sincerely glad to be in it. She and Homer developed the habits of a married life with the careful deliberateness of two people who had not expected to be in this particular arrangement, but who were determined to do it honestly. They were respectful of each other's space, attentive to each other's moods, and found their way toward ease through the accumulation of small moments, sharing the lamp at the table in the evenings, one reading while the other mended or worked through ranch accounts. The habit Homer had of bringing in an extra armful of firewood without being asked, knowing she liked the room warm. The way Evelyn always set aside the darkest coffee for his second cup, because she had noticed early on that he preferred it strongest in the second round. And underneath all of this practicality, something else was growing, something neither of them rushed, but that both of them were aware of in the way you are aware of the sun coming up before you can quite see it, the light changing before the source is visible. One evening in January, there was a storm-proper winter wind driving hard across the plains, rattling the windows and making the fire pull and gust in the chimney. They had eaten supper and Homer was going over the accounts at the table and Evelyn was reading the novel that Martha Blaine had lent her, and the dog, a large, amiable hound named Governor that had been Thomas's dog and had transferred his allegiance to both of them equally, was asleep in front of the fire. The storm got louder and Evelyn looked up from her book. "Dolph and the others are in the bunkhouse." "They are. It's solid. They'll be fine." Homer looked up. "Are you worried?" "Not exactly. I've just never been in a storm like this out in the open country. In Cincinnati, a storm meant the windows rattled and the street flooded. This feels larger somehow." He considered this. "It is larger. There's nothing to break the wind for about 200 miles. She looked at the window where the darkness was moving in thick, rapid sheets. "That's a remarkable thing to live with. You get used to it," he said. "And then you start to, I don't know, like it, the scale of it, the honesty of it. A storm out here doesn't pretend to be anything else." She looked at him. He had said something like that once before about the land, the honesty of it. She had been thinking about that word as it applied to him. He was, she had concluded, one of the most genuinely honest people she had encountered, honest in a way that was not blunt but deliberate, as though he had decided early on that honesty was the only practical policy and had adhered to it ever since. "Homer," she said, he looked up from the accounts. "I want to tell you something and I want you to hear it as what it is and not as something I feel I ought to say." He set down his pen. "All right. I am glad I am here. I am glad it is you." She held his gaze steadily. "I know the circumstances were what they were, and I know Thomas, I know that this is complicated, but I am genuinely glad." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I have been trying not to say something similar for about 2 months. "Why?" "Because it felt wrong to be glad," he said, "given what it cost." She nodded. She understood that. "But you are?" "Yes," he said quietly. "Very." The storm outside did what storms do, built to its peak, and then gradually, over the course of the night, settled into the ordinary winter dark. Inside the house, something had been said that needed saying, and the room felt different afterward, warmer and more inhabited, as though the admitting of it had changed the air. February brought a brief, beautiful thaw, 3 days of surprising warmth that made the prairie smell of damp earth and melting ice, and something green trying to push through. And in those 3 days, Homer took Evelyn on a long ride across the southern range, to show her the part of the property she hadn't yet seen. They rode side by side along the creek, which was running high and fast with snowmelt from further north, and Homer showed her where the fence line met the neighboring Larkspur Creek spread, and the cottonwood grove that flooded every spring and then turned brilliant gold in October, and a particular bend in the creek where, he said, he had spent many hours as a boy fishing with complete and serious dedication and very little success. She laughed at that, a real laugh, not a polite one. No success at all. Thomas used to say, I frightened them off by thinking too loudly, he said. She laughed again, and he smiled at her, a full smile this time, no qualification, and the winter light caught his face in a way that made her feel the sudden pure specific joy of being exactly where she was. They stopped at the cottonwood grove and let the horses drink, and stood together at the creek's edge watching the water go by, and Homer said, Thomas used to bring this up every time we argued. He would say, you can't fish and you can't dance, so what exactly is your selling point? And what did you say? I said I could do arithmetic in my head and I had never once lost a calf on my watch. He glanced at her. He was not particularly impressed. I am impressed, she said. Those are genuinely useful qualities. He looked at her with something that was not quite the almost smile but something more than it, something open and warm and direct. And she looked back at him with the same quality of looking, and he reached across the small distance between them and took her hand and held it, and she held it back, and the creek went on with its serious, cheerful rushing, and the cottonwood stood bare and patient waiting for spring. Prout tried once more in March, a more direct approach this time. He had found a lawyer from San Antonio who sent a letter claiming a lien on a portion of the eastern pasture based on a survey discrepancy from 1878. Homer rode to Millhaven and was on his way back the same day with a counter-document from the county recorder proving the survey in question had been superseded by a corrected filing in 1880. He brought the lawyer's letter home and showed it to Evelyn and said, It's done. He'll know by now that we have the records and that the claim doesn't hold. I don't think he'll try again. What changed? She asked. Why does he give up now? Because men like Prout only pursue the easy targets, Homer said. Once you demonstrate that you intend to defend yourself properly and that you have the documentation to do it, the calculation changes. It's not worth his time and money to pursue a legal fight he can't win, she nodded. And Sheriff Aldred, still watching, Aldred told me this week that he'd heard Prout has been making overtures toward a ranch up near the county line that's in more difficult straits than ours. He'll turn his attention there. Homer paused. It's not justice for whoever is up there. No, she said, it isn't. She thought about the unfairness of it, the way men like Prout moved from target to target, and the way that justice was always unevenly distributed in the spaces between towns, where the law was present but thin. Is there anything to be done? I've spoken to Aldred. He's going to reach out to the sheriff in that county. He looked at her. It may not be enough, but you did what you could. Yes. She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. That counts, Homer. He turned his hand over and caught hers for a moment before releasing it. It was a small thing, but the small things between them had become a language of their own. Spring came to the Texas prairie with the extravagance of a place that has a great deal of room in which to express itself. The creek flooded the cottonwood grove exactly as Homer had said it would, and the pastures turned from winter yellow to a green so vivid it looked painted, and the cattle moved back to the upper range with the satisfaction of animals returning to a place they know. Evelyn planted the kitchen garden again, this time with additions, tomatoes and sweet corn and climbing beans, and a section of sunflowers along the south fence that she planted for no practical reason, except that she had always wanted to grow them. She had realized somewhere in the deep of winter, happy. It was not the uncomplicated happiness of a person who has never known difficulty. It had the texture of something earned, of something built from unlikely materials that had turned out to be stronger than expected. She was happy in the way that a person is happy when the life they are living is genuinely, authentically their own. Homer was 31 that spring and Evelyn was 25, and they had been married 7 months, and the ease between them had grown from the careful, deliberate ease of two strangers being courteous into something that felt native as natural and unself-conscious as breathing. He knew how she liked her coffee. She knew that he woke in the night sometimes with the particular restlessness of grief, not for Thomas alone, but for the version of his life that Thomas's death had changed, and that the best thing to do was to say something ordinary, the cattle count for the next day, what they needed from town, and let him anchor himself in the present. And she knew something else, which was that she loved him. She had been knowing it for some time, in the incremental way that you come to know the shape of a landscape you have been walking through. Not a single revelation, but an accumulation of small recognitions, until one day you look up and understand that you know this place completely. She told him on a May evening when the air smelled of grass and honeysuckle, and the light was going slowly over the western plain. They were sitting on the porch after supper, not talking particularly, just existing in the company of the evening, and she said, "I love you, Homer." She said it simply, the way she said most important things without decoration. He was quiet for long enough that she had a moment of wondering whether she had misjudged, and then he turned to her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, completely unguarded, open in a way that he rarely allowed himself to be, something that was not composure and not control, but something much more human than either. "Evelyn," he said, "you don't have to say it back if I love you," he said. "I have loved you since February at least, probably before." He said it with the same quality of simplicity that she had, not decorated, just true. "I wasn't certain I had the right to." She looked at him. "You have the right," she said. He reached across and tucked a strand of her hair back from her cheek, which was not something he had done before, and the tenderness of it was so straightforward and so sincere that she felt it settle through her like warmth from the inside out. He left his hand against her cheek for a moment, and she leaned into it slightly, and the prairie evening went on around them, indifferent and vast and beautiful. They had a proper summer then, the first summer that was fully theirs, working the ranch through the heat of June and July, riding out together on the boundary checks when the work allowed it, sitting on the porch in the cooler evenings with Governor at their feet, and the coyotes singing somewhere out in the dark. Homer began to teach Evelyn to handle the cattle properly, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to, and because he found he liked teaching her, liked the way she paid attention and asked sensible questions, and didn't pretend to have mastered something before she had. She was a good rider by midsummer, not yet as instinctive as Homer, but capable and confident. And one afternoon when they were moving a small group of steers along the creek to the upper pasture, and one of them broke and ran for the draw, she went after it without thinking and cut it off at the cottonwood stand, and brought it back to the group with a precision that made Homer pull up slate and watch her with the expression of a man who is genuinely surprised and genuinely pleased. "Where did that come from?" he called. She rode back to him, grinning, slightly out of breath. "I have been watching you do it all summer." "You're good at watching and translating," he said, and it was the highest compliment he was capable of giving, and she knew it. "You are a very good teacher," she said. "I've never taught anyone before," he said. He looked at her with the full warmth of it, and she felt it like sunlight. In August, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. She told Homer on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions: surprise, then something broader and more luminous, then a quick and visible concern. Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Better than well." He came around the table and crouched in front of her chair, which was something so uncharacteristically impulsive for him that she laughed from sheer surprise, and he took both her hands in his and held them and looked at her with such an expression of tender, serious joy that she thought her heart might not contain all of it. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes," she said, laughing still. "I know. We're going to, yes." He was quiet for a moment, just holding her hands, looking at her. "Thomas would have been glad," he said finally. It was said without sadness, or not only sadness, said with the complexity of a man who had made his peace with grief and found room for joy inside it. "I think he would have," she said gently. Homer stood and pulled her up with him and held her with the particular careful intensity of someone holding something they know to be precious. And she put her arms around him and held him back with the full-hearted certainty of a woman who is exactly where she belongs. Martha Blaine in town was delighted by the news and began knitting immediately. Dolph shook Homer's hand for a long time and then went out to the barn and appeared to be very busy with something structural for the next half hour. Pete said it was wonderful news, and then said it again twice more over the course of the afternoon, because he had apparently run out of other words for it. Cal brought a bottle of good whiskey from somewhere unspecified, and presented it to Homer with a nod that communicated a great deal. Evelyn felt well through the autumn pregnancy, tired in the early weeks, but the tiredness of hard work and not the tiredness of illness. And she continued the garden through to harvest, and preserved everything there was to preserve, and spent the fall evenings making things for the baby with a craftsman's attention and a mother's love. Homer watched over her with an attentiveness that was not smothering but thorough, always aware of where she was, always making sure the things she needed were to hand before she needed them, carrying the heavier loads without comment. He was, she thought, a man who expressed love primarily through action, and the actions were constant and specific and dear to her. She told him this one evening in October, sitting by the fire. "You show your love by doing things," she said. "You always have." He looked at her. Is that all right?" "It is more than all right," she said. "I grew up with people who said a great many kind things and did very little. I prefer it your way." He smiled, a full, real smile, the kind that had been appearing more regularly now, less rare, less careful. "You are remarkably easy to love," he said. "Don't say that," she said. "I am not always easy. I am stubborn and I have opinions about everything, and I was in the middle of a sentence the other morning about fence posts and you were not listening." "I was listening," he said. "You thought the south section needed closer spacing. I agreed with you." She stared at him. "You did not say so." "I fixed it the next day," he said simply. She laughed, and he laughed, and the fire went on doing its work in the fireplace, and Governor thumped his tail on the rug, and outside the October wind moved across the wide, dark prairie, carrying the smell of cold earth and the distant suggestion of winter. Their son was born on the 9th of January, 1884, in the bedroom of the Conroy Ranch house, delivered by a competent and blessedly calm midwife named Mrs. Vera Cross, who had been doing this work for 30 years and had clearly seen everything. Homer was outside during the labor, walking the porch in the cold with Governor at his heels, and when Vera opened the door and told him it was time to come in, he entered the bedroom with the expression of a man who had prepared himself for emotion and discovered that no preparation was sufficient. The baby was healthy and loud and had Homer's dark hair and what appeared to be his own opinions about the circumstances of his arrival. Evelyn held him and looked at Homer over the baby's head and saw something on his face that she thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "What do we name him?" Homer asked, sitting in the chair beside the bed that he had pulled close enough to be touching distance. She had been thinking about this. "I would like to name him Thomas," she said. Homer was still. Then he said, "Evelyn," he stopped, tried again. "You would do that? He was your brother," she said. "He was the reason I came here and the reason I found you. That seems worth honoring." Homer looked down at the baby, at Thomas, and she could see what was happening in his face, and she did not look away from it. He was a private man with his grief, but he was not hiding it now, and she thought that was its own kind of progress, its own kind of healing. "Thomas Conroy," he said quietly, and there was so much in how he said it that it could not all be named. Then he looked up at her. "Thank you." She reached for his hand and he gave it, and they sat together in the warmth of the bedroom while the January cold pressed against the windows, and little Thomas made his feelings known about various things with the unself-conscious authority of someone who has just arrived and is finding their voice. Life on the Conroy Ranch in the years that followed had the particular richness of a life being genuinely and fully lived. Thomas grew quickly, as babies do when they have good food and warm houses and parents who find everything they do fascinating. And by the time he was a year old, he was following Governor around the kitchen with the determined concentration of someone conducting an important investigation. Homer began teaching him things from the earliest possible age, not because he was impatient but because he could not help it, the way that people who love something want to share it, carrying the boy with him on the morning rounds, showing him the cattle, the horses, the creek, the sky. Evelyn watched them together and felt a love for Homer that had more dimensions than she could count, a love that was built now from years and specific moments and the accumulated knowing of a real shared life. He was a better man than he knew himself to be, which was perhaps the defining characteristic of good men. They had no idea of their own quality. In 1885, when Thomas was 18 months old, the ranch had its best cattle year yet. Homer had made a good deal the previous autumn with a cattle buyer from Fort Worth, and the income allowed him to hire 2 additional hands and expand the herd to a size that began to feel like genuine prosperity. He also, without telling Evelyn, had a room added to the back of the house, a proper sitting room with good windows facing south, because he had noticed that she always moved her reading chair to find the best light and the back of the house had always had the best afternoon sun. She discovered the plan when she heard hammering one morning and went out to find Dolph and a carpenter named Hobbs working on the new framing, and she went looking for Homer and found him by the barn looking like a man who has been found out. "You could have told me," she said. "I wanted it to be done before I told you," he said. "I didn't want you to spend weeks thinking about whether it was too expensive." She looked at him. "It is too expensive. We can afford it," he said. "We had a good year." "I know we had a good year. I did the accounts." "Then you know it's affordable." She crossed her arms. He met her gaze steadily with the particular patience of a man who knows he is right about something. She uncrossed her arms. "Fine," she said, "but I want shelves on the south wall." "I'll tell Hobbs," he said. She walked back to the house, and she was smiling before she reached the porch, and she did not look back to see whether he saw it, but he did. Little Thomas was not little for long in the way that children aren't. By 1887, when he was 3 years old, he had developed a strong personality that combined his mother's directness with his father's quiet observational quality, in a combination that made him simultaneously very easy and very interesting to be around. He talked constantly about everything, with a seriousness of purpose that Dolph described as just like his Uncle Thomas, which made Homer and Evelyn look at each other over the old man's head with the particular expression of people sharing something they don't have words for. Dolph was growing older, as old men do, and Homer had given him lighter duties without making it feel like a demotion, because Homer understood dignity and knew how to protect it. Dolph spent more of his time now in the kitchen talking to Evelyn while she cooked, or in the south-facing sitting room in the afternoons when the light came in warm and good, telling young Thomas stories about the early days of the ranch, with the relish of a man who has a good audience for the first time. In 1888, Evelyn was pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was somewhat harder, not dangerous, but more tiring, more physically demanding, and she was 6 years older than she had been the first time, which Vera Cross, when she came for the first check, said was nothing to worry about but something to respect. Homer responded to this information by becoming somewhat more attentive than usual, which Evelyn managed with the good humor of a woman who has been loved consistently for 6 years and knows how to receive it without losing herself in it. She told him one evening when he had brought her tea she hadn't asked for and repositioned the lamp for her reading and asked twice in 1 hour whether she was comfortable. "Homer, I am pregnant, not made of glass." He sat down. "I know. You are hovering. I know that too. It is very sweet," she said, "but I need you to trust that I will tell you when I need something." He looked at her steadily. "I trust you completely. It's the rest of the universe I'm uncertain about." She loved him so much in that moment that it was almost comic. "The universe is generally on our side," she said. "It has been this far." "Yes," he said, and he reached over and put his hand against her face in that particular way of his that was the most tender thing she had ever experienced anyone do, and she leaned into it, and he said, "Yes, it has." Their second child, a boy they named Samuel Sam from the first day, arrived in February of 1889 with considerably more efficiency than his brother had, as though he had decided that the world was interesting and he was not going to waste time getting to it. He had Evelyn's coloring and Homer's eyes, and Thomas, now 5, regarded him with a mixture of fascination and suspicion that eventually, over the course of about 3 weeks, resolved entirely into devotion. The ranch was genuinely flourishing by now. Homer had proved to be a rancher of the first order, not because he was the most aggressive businessman, but because he was thorough and honest and made decisions based on what he could see clearly rather than what he hoped to see. And in ranching, these qualities tended to produce good results over time. They had 40 head of good cattle, a horse operation that Homer had built quietly over 3 years, and that was beginning to produce animals of real quality. And the land itself was healthy in the way that land is healthy when it is worked intelligently and not stripped. Evelyn had, in the years of her marriage, become known in and around Millhaven as a woman of substance and capability. She had organized, with Martha Blaine, a small lending library from the back of the millinery shop, a collection of donated books that the families of the area could borrow, and this had grown over 4 years into something genuinely used and genuinely valued. She had also been instrumental in getting a proper school organized for the town, writing letters to the county authority, and attending 2 meetings in Millhaven, with the measured persistence that came naturally to a woman who had decided that something ought to exist and was going to make it exist. The school opened in 1887 in a small building on the edge of town with a young teacher named Miss Aldridge who had come from Austin and was, Evelyn thought, exactly right for the job, patient with children and utterly unprepared to accept any nonsense from anyone else. Thomas Conroy was among the first students, and he took to reading with a speed and appetite that made Evelyn suspect he had been ready for books for some time and had simply been waiting for someone to make them available. Millhaven itself was changing in those years, as all the frontier towns were changing, growing, filling in, acquiring the features of permanence. The saloon was still there, but Prude had sold his interest in it and moved on, eventually, as men of his type always moved on, toward some other place with other easy targets. The hotel had expanded. A doctor had come and stayed. The church had a new bell tower. These were small changes, but they were the kind of changes that accumulate into the transformation of a wild place into a civilized one. And Evelyn watched them with the interest of a woman who had had a hand in a few of them, and knew what that kind of effort cost and what it was worth. In the evenings of those years, the late 1880s, when Thomas was growing fast and Sam was beginning to walk and then run and then never stop moving, the ranch house was the fullest it had ever been. Homer had added another bedroom to accommodate the family, and the south-facing sitting room with its good windows and Evelyn's shelves of books had become the place where the family gathered after supper, Thomas reading on the floor with Governor's considerable bulk pressed against his legs, Sam conducting independent investigations into the contents of low shelves that had to be baby-proofed with exhausting regularity, and Homer and Evelyn sitting together on the settee that had been a Christmas gift from Martha Blaine, speaking quietly about the day's events, or simply sitting in the kind of silence that is not absence but fullness. Homer had, over these years, become easier with himself, less guarded, less careful in the way of a man who is not sure of his welcome. He laughed more freely, and his opinions came out more readily, and he told stories about his boyhood on the ranch that he had never told anyone and that Evelyn received as the gifts they were. He had not forgotten Thomas. She knew he never would, and she did not want him to. They kept Thomas's cross in the small cemetery tended and clear, and Homer visited it on his own sometimes in the early mornings, and this was something Evelyn gave him without comment, because she understood that some griefs need their private space, and that providing that space was its own form of love. She had her own version of the same ritual. Every now and then, on a quiet morning, she would take out the letters that Thomas Conroy had written to her, the ones she had received in Cincinnati before coming west, and read them once more. Not to mourn the man she had never met, but to remember the beginning of the path that had led her here, to honor the chain of events that had brought her to this particular house and this particular life and this particular love. She had told Homer she did this, and he had been quiet for a moment and then said, "I'm glad you kept them." That was all, and it was enough. In 1891, when Thomas Conroy was 7 and Sam was 2, and the ranch was at the height of its prosperity, and Homer was 38 and Evelyn was 33, Dolph passed away in his sleep in the bunkhouse on a March night, peacefully and apparently without distress. He had not been ill exactly. He had been old and tiring and more recently content to sit in the sun and watch things rather than participate in them, which they had all understood without saying. He was buried in the ranch cemetery next to the elder Conroys, and Homer said a few words that were plain-spoken and true, and Evelyn planted a rose bush at the head of his grave in the spring because Dolph had mentioned once, without apparent context, that his mother had grown roses. He was the last one who knew the ranch from the beginning, Homer said to Evelyn that evening. He said it quietly, not dramatically, the way he said things that had weight. "Yes," she said. She sat beside him and rested her head against his shoulder, but the beginning is still in everything he helped build. Homer put his arm around her. "That's true." He was quiet for a moment. Thomas would have been glad that he stayed so long. Dolph was always, he paused. He was always the one constant, no matter what else changed. "And now you are," she said. "You and this land and this family." He held her closer, and she could feel him breathing steadily, working through whatever he needed to work through, and she stayed still and warm beside him and let him find his way to it. The summer of 1891 was one that Evelyn would remember as one of the best of her life, which is a remarkable thing to be able to say about a particular season, but it earned it. The weather was cooperative, the cattle were healthy, Thomas had learned to ride properly and was rarely off a horse when the work allowed it, and Sam had developed a fascination with flowers that resulted in him bringing Evelyn small, crushed offerings from the garden several times a day, with the gravity of someone presenting significant gifts. Homer and Evelyn celebrated their 9th wedding anniversary in November with a dinner at the hotel in Millhaven, their one annual luxury, the one evening each year when they went somewhere and ate food prepared by someone other than Evelyn and sat across a white-clothed table and looked at each other in the particular pleasure of two people who have chosen well. At that dinner, Homer said, 9 years. 9 years, she agreed. I don't know where they went, he said, and I don't want to find them. I want to keep going forward. She smiled at him across the table. You are becoming sentimental, she said. Don't tell anyone, he said. I have a reputation, she laughed. As what exactly? A serious man. You are a serious man. You are also a man who came to meet a stranger at a train station when you were in the middle of your own grief and offered her a room and a chance and every promise his brother had made. She held his gaze. That is not just seriousness. That is character. He looked at her steadily across the candle-lit table of the Millhaven Hotel, this man she had come west to find and had instead found differently, better, in all the ways that matter. You gave me as much as I gave you, he said. More, you made the house into a home, you made me easier in myself. I don't know if I've ever said that clearly. You have shown it, she said. That is enough. I want to say it clearly, he said. I am happy, Evelyn, I am truly and completely happy, I want you to know that. She reached across the table and took his hand. I know it, she said, and I am too, completely. They rode home through the November night, cold and clear. stars thrown across the sky with the extravagance that only the open country allows, and the horses moved at an easy pace along the familiar track. And Homer had his arm around Evelyn's shoulder against the cold, and she leaned into his warmth, and the ranch house came into view with the warm yellow squares of the lighted windows, where Pete, who was now the head hand, was keeping an eye on the boys, and Governor was surely asleep in front of the fire. And everything they had built together was waiting for them. The years turned as years do on working land, marked not by the calendar so much as by the rhythm of seasons and cattle and planting and harvest, the particular ceremonies of a ranching life. Thomas turned 10 and could rope and ride, and had developed his father's quiet, thorough way of working and his mother's habit of reading everything he could lay hands on, which combination made him a very effective and slightly unusual child. Sam turned 5 and then 6, and remained a creature of intense feeling and constant motion, who brought flowers to his mother and followed his father everywhere, and had an absolute conviction that Governor understood every word he said, which Governor encouraged by appearing to listen very carefully. In 1893, when Thomas was 9 and Sam was 4, Evelyn began writing for the Millhaven Gazette, a small local paper that had started 2 years earlier and was run by a man named Cleaver who had come from Kansas with a printing press and an alarming amount of ambition. She wrote a weekly column about practical homesteading matters, preserving, kitchen gardening, managing a household through hard seasons. That became, to Cleaver's considerable surprise, the most read portion of the paper. Letters came in from women across the county with questions and additions, and Evelyn answered each one personally when she could, because she remembered being a woman who needed practical information and had no one to give it to her. Homer read every column, which she knew because he had opinions about all of them, offered quietly and without assumption, the way he offered all his opinions. She found his observations useful, which she told him, and he said that he found it remarkable that she could make turnip preservation interesting, which she told him was not a compliment in the form he thought it was. The Gazette work had an interesting side effect, which was that it brought Evelyn into contact with women across the region who were facing the particular difficulties of frontier life, as women isolation, overwork, the injustices of laws that gave them very little property ownership or legal standing, the social pressures that limited what they could do or say or be. She wrote about these things carefully and specifically, not as polemics but as the documented reality of women's lives, and the response was significant. She was aware that she was fortunate. She had a husband who respected her completely, a home that was securely hers, an education that allowed her to write clearly, and she used that fortune in the way it seemed it ought to be used. Homer supported this without reservation. When she told him she wanted to go to a meeting in Millhaven about a proposed state bill that would affect women's ability to hold property jointly with their husbands, he said, "I'll drive you." When she came home from that meeting animated and slightly furious about what had been said, he listened to the whole account and said, "Write about it." When her column on the subject generated letters from men who thought it was none of a woman's business, Homer read those letters and said, "Give me their names. I'll send them a copy of the county property records showing that without the legal recognition of women's contributions, half the ranches in this county would not exist." She had looked at him across the kitchen table and thought, as she often did, that she had in some impossible and wonderful way ended up with exactly the right man. In the October of 1895, Homer proposed something that surprised her. He came in from the South Range on a weekday afternoon when she hadn't expected him, and she looked up from the column she was writing at the kitchen table and saw the expression on his face, which was the thoughtful, deliberate expression of someone who has been turning an idea over in their mind for some time and has finally decided to speak it. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Where?" "Cincinnati." She set down her pen. "What? I know that you haven't been back since you came west," he said. I know your aunt died 3 years ago and that you had some friends there, and I thought maybe it would be good to see where you came from, to close it properly." He paused. "And also because the railroad runs through, and I thought we might take the boys and let them see a city. Thomas is old enough to appreciate it." She looked at him for a long moment. The thought of Cincinnati, she had not let herself think about it much, because there had always been so much in the present to think about, and because the past she had come from was not one she was particularly hungry to revisit. But Homer's framing of it, to close it properly, was the right framing, she thought. To go back not as the woman who had escaped, but as the woman she had become. "All right," she said. They went in the spring of 1896. Homer and Evelyn and Thomas, now 12, and Sam, now 7, on the eastbound train with a trunk and a carpet-bag, and the same sparrow brooch that Evelyn had carried west 14 years earlier. The boys were transfixed by the train and by the changing landscape, and by everything they saw, and Homer watched them with the expression of a man who is seeing the world fresh through his children's eyes, and finding it very fine. Cincinnati was louder and larger and more complicated than the flat, honest beauty of the Texas plain, and Evelyn found herself walking its streets with the slightly displaced feeling of returning to a place that knew you once but doesn't anymore. She showed Homer and the boys the boarding house where she had grown up. It had changed owners twice and was now a dry goods storage, and the church where her mother was buried, and the street where she had bought her train ticket west. She stood at the station with Homer beside her and looked at the westbound platform and thought about the woman who had stood here 14 years ago with a trunk and a carpet-bag and a letter from a man she had never met, and she felt that woman as something separate and beloved, younger, uncertain, brave in the way that people are brave when they have no other choice. "Are you all right?" Homer asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm remembering." He took her hand. "Anything good?" She thought about it. "The courage of it," she said. "I was very scared. I didn't show it, but I was terrified." "You didn't look terrified on the platform in Millhaven," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "You noticed?" "I noticed everything about you the moment I saw you," he said simply. "I was trying to figure out how to do the right thing by a woman my brother had promised things to, and I looked at you and thought, this is a woman who is going to make everything more complicated and better at the same time." She laughed, a full, unrestrained laugh right there in the Cincinnati station. "Is that what you thought?" "More or less," he said, completely serious. "I was right." They went back to Texas with Thomas and Sam full of stories about the city, and sufficiently impressed by it that Homer felt the trip had accomplished something, and Evelyn went back with the particular piece of a person who has looked clearly at where they came from and understood completely why they chose to go. The ranch entered the 20th century in fine shape. The year 1900 brought with it changes to the region, more roads, more towns, the railroad extending its reach further into the western country, that Homer watched with the careful attention of a man who has learned that change is better met by understanding than resistance. He adapted the ranch operation over time, invested in improved stock, maintained the horse breeding operation that had become by now a significant source of income, and continued to work the land with the kind of respect that keeps land productive over generations. Thomas, now 16 in 1900, was clearly going to be a rancher. It was in every choice he made, every hour he spent outdoors, every question he asked his father about the land and the animals and the practical science of making things grow. Sam, at 11, was less certain of his future and more interested in the world beyond the ranch, and Evelyn watched him with the specific love of a mother who knows her child will need a different kind of horizon and is already making peace with the going. Homer turned 47 in 1900 and looked like a man who had lived his years well. The lines on his face were the lines of weather and expression, and his hair had gone to silver at the temples, and he moved with the unhurried authority of someone who is exactly where they belong. Evelyn was 42, and she had earned her own lines, and wore them without apology, and felt more herself than she had ever been in her younger years. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed. It had been their place from nearly the beginning, the porch facing west so that the sunset went across the prairie in front of them in whatever form the sky chose to give it, which was rarely the same twice and was always worth watching. Governor had died years ago, of old age and general satisfaction, and had been succeeded by a dog named Clarence, who had been succeeded by a dog named Rex, who had been succeeded by the current dog, a large and philosophically inclined hound named Abbott, who conducted his watch over the property with great seriousness. One evening on that porch in the late summer of 1900, with the sky going from gold to rose to the deep blue of early dark, Evelyn said, "I have been thinking about something." Homer looked at her. "Tell me." "The school in Millhaven needs a second teacher. Miss Aldrich has been managing alone for too long, and the enrollment has doubled in the past 5 years. I've been talking to the county board and they have funds approved but cannot find a suitable candidate." And Homer said, knowing there was more, "I thought I might teach there part of the week." He was quiet for a moment. "You have the column. I can do both. The column is 2 mornings a week. Teaching would be 3. The boys are old enough that I'm not needed in the same constant way." He looked at her. "What would you teach?" "Reading and writing. The younger grades." She paused. "I know what it meant to me, the ability to read and write and argue and communicate. I would like to give that to children who might not otherwise have it." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw in his face everything she always saw there, the quiet, thorough love of a man who knows the woman in front of him completely and is glad of every part of her. "Then do it," he said. She smiled. "You are very easy." "I am not easy," he said. "I am simply right." She laughed, and he smiled, and Abbott raised his head briefly from the porch boards and then returned to his philosophical contemplations. Evelyn taught at the Millhaven school for 4 years, the primary grades, 3 mornings a week, riding in on Rosie's replacement, a steadier young mare named Clover, and coming home in the afternoons with the particular satisfied tiredness of someone who has done useful work. She was a good teacher, which did not entirely surprise her. She had her mother's instinct for it, she thought, though she had not known it until now. She was firm and clear and interested in the children as individual people, which went a long way. Homer came into town on her teaching days sometimes, on ranch business or the pretense of it, and she would see Slate tied at the hitching post outside the general store when she came out of the schoolhouse, and she would find him inside, and they would ride home together through whatever the afternoon offered, talking about the day's events with the ease of 2 people who have been talking to each other for 20 years and have not yet run out of things to say. Thomas married in 1906, at 22, a young woman from a neighboring ranch named Ruth who had grown up riding and working cattle and had opinions about everything and a laugh that carried across a room. Evelyn liked her immediately, which Homer said he had predicted, and which was true. The wedding was in Millhaven Church, the same church where Homer and Evelyn had married 24 years earlier, and Evelyn sat beside Homer in the front pew and felt the time in it, not as a weight but as a richness. All those years between the nervous woman in the blue wool dress and the woman sitting here now, watching her son. Homer put his hand over hers during the ceremony quietly, and she turned her hand over and held his. And they sat like that while Thomas and Ruth said the words that she and Homer had said, and the afternoon light came through the church windows in the long rectangles she had once seen in the ranch house for the first time, and everything was full and complete and good. Sam, as she had known he would, eventually left the ranch, not unhappily but necessarily, following the pull of a wider world. He went to Austin at 19 to study, came back to visit with the regularity of someone who loves where he comes from while needing to be somewhere else, and eventually became a lawyer, which Evelyn found both appropriate and slightly amusing given that it had been a lawyer's letter from Pruitt's man that had once been the sharpest legal threat the ranch had faced. Sam used his law for good uses, tenant rights, property disputes, the kind of cases where an ordinary person needed someone capable on their side. And Evelyn was as proud of him as she was of Thomas, differently, because they were different. In 1910, Homer and Evelyn were 67 and 52, which were good ages to be when you had your health and your land and your family around you. Thomas and Ruth had 2 boys of their own, young Homer, named for his grandfather with a solemnity that had made old Homer visibly moved, and James, who was 4 and already showed every sign of the restless energy his grandmother recognized from young Sam. Ruth was expecting again, and the house was the kind of full that only comes from a family that has grown properly outward. Evelyn had stopped teaching the previous year, when her knees decided to have opinions about the ride to Millhaven 3 times a week, but she continued the column, which Cleaver's son now ran after his father's retirement, and which had by now been reprinting letters from women across 3 counties for 12 years. She was, she supposed, a woman of some influence in the region, which was a thing she had never expected and found both gratifying and slightly funny. Homer had reduced his active ranch work, handing the daily operations largely to Thomas, who was better at it anyway, more of an instinct for the business side, which Homer acknowledged freely and without ego. Homer spent more time on the horses, which had always been where he was most himself, and on the long boundary rides that were, she suspected, more meditation than inspection, the way that time in wide open country becomes when you have spent a lifetime in it and learned its particular language. They still rode together when the weather was right. Evelyn on Clover's current replacement, a reliable gray named Pearl, and Homer on Slate's current successor, a dark bay named River, out to the cottonwood grove along the creek, or along the southern range where the grass went gold in October just as it always had. The creek still ran clear. The cottonwood still turned brilliant gold. The cattle still moved with the same patient, unhurried purpose across the land that Homer's father had first worked, and Thomas and Homer had inherited, and Homer and Evelyn had made into something that could pass to another generation with roots deep enough to hold. On an October afternoon in 1910, they rode out to the creek, the same grove, and tied the horses, and stood at the water's edge as they had stood so many times before. The light was the particular autumn light that Evelyn had come to love above all other lights, low and golden, and making everything it touched look as though it had been waiting all year to be seen in exactly this way. 48 years, Homer said. He was looking at the water. We haven't been married 48 years, she said. Not yet. I was calculating forward. He looked at her. We will have been married 48 years in 1930. She looked at him. That's a long calculation to make spontaneously. I've been thinking about it, he said, about what 48 more years of this would look like. She was quiet for a moment, watching the water. And what did you decide? That I would like to find out, he said simply. She turned to him. He was standing with his hat in his hand, and the creek light on his face and the silver at his temples catching it. And he was looking at her with the same full, unguarded warmth that had been building between them for 28 years. The warmth of a love that had been tested by loss and time and difficulty, and had come through all of it not diminished but increased. Deeper and more specific and more enduring than anything either of them could have imagined on a train platform in Millhaven in September of 1882. She stepped toward him and put her hand against his face, the same gesture he had made to her so many times, returned now, and he covered her hand with his and held it there, and she said, I intend to be here for all of it. He turned his face and pressed his lips to her palm briefly and with great tenderness, and then straightened and looked at her again and said, Good. The creek went on with its serious, cheerful rushing. The cottonwoods bent in the slow October wind. The horses moved at the bank, patient and unhurried. And Homer Conroy and Evelyn Bell, who had come to each other through loss and circumstance, and the peculiar grace of a wild country that makes room for unexpected things, stood together at the water's edge in the long golden light of a Texas autumn, whole and in love and entirely, completely home. Back at the ranch that evening, smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney where Ruth was making supper, and young Homer was somewhere in the barn making the kind of noise that 7-year-old boys make in barns, and James was running across the yard toward his grandfather as they rode in, arms out, face wide open with the uncomplicated joy of greeting someone he loved. And old Homer swung down from river and caught the boy and lifted him and held him against his chest, laughing. And Evelyn pulled Pearl to a stop and watched them, the boy and the man, the grandfather and the grandchild, the ranch and the family and the land stretching out gold and wide behind them under the October sky, and she thought that there was nowhere else in the world she would rather be, nothing else she would rather have built, no other life she would rather have chosen. She dismounted and walked across the yard, and Homer reached out and took her hand as she came near, still holding James in his other arm, and the three of them stood there in the last of the afternoon light, while Thomas came out of the barn, and Ruth called from the kitchen door, and the ordinary beautiful evening of a family's life began to unfold around them in all its fullness. This was the life that had started with a letter on a Tuesday, and a train heading west, and a platform in a frontier town where a man with grief in his eyes had taken his hat off and said, "My name is Homer Conroy, and I am truly sorry for what has happened, and I would like to make it right." He had made it right, and more than right, and she had helped him, and together they had made something that neither of them could have made alone, something solid and warm and rooted, as deep as the well that had never run dry, as wide as the sky over the Texas plain, as enduring as the love of two people who had chosen each other in the full knowledge of what choosing costs and what it gives. And the evening settled in around them, warm and full of voices, and the stars came out one by one over the Conroy Ranch, and everything that had ever been promised was kept.